A rainy morning. A silver SUV pulled up outside Ethan's small garage. The door opened. A young woman lowered herself into her wheelchair using an automatic lift, smooth and practiced. She smiled. "I use a wheelchair," she said, "but I still drive myself." Ethan nodded. He didn't ask further. He just took the keys. Checking the undercarriage, he noticed something strange. A weld that didn't belong to the original frame. The more he examined it, the quieter he became. This car hadn't been in the accident her file described. Someone had hidden the truth for 2 years. Ethan Cole runs a small garage that specializes in repairing cars after accidents. He is 40 years old, honest to a fault, and never once cuts a corner just to save time or money, even when a shortcut would have cost him nothing but his own conscience. His garage sits on a quiet corner of town, nothing fancy. A single bay and a hand-painted sign that had faded years ago and never been replaced. Mostly because Ethan preferred to spend money on parts and tools rather than appearances. Regular customers knew him by reputation more than by the sign out front. Before opening the shop, Ethan worked for years as a collision investigation technician, reading damage the way most people read a book, understanding exactly what a scrape or a bent frame was actually trying to say. It's a skill that never fully left him, even after he traded that job for a quieter life fixing cars in his own name. He is a widower, raising his 10-year-old son Ben on his own since his wife passed away from illness several years earlier. Money is tight most months, but Ethan has never once let that change how carefully he does his work. Ben still remembered pieces of his mother, mostly small things, the sound of her laugh, the way she hummed while cooking, though most of what he actually understood about her now came from the stories his father told at dinner. Ethan made sure those stories never stopped coming. When a car breaks, he tells Ben, wiping grease from his hands at the end of a long shift, you replace the part. When trust breaks, that's a lot harder to fix. Ben nods along seriously every time he hears it, young enough to still believe every word his father says is exactly true, and old enough to be starting to understand why it matters. Ben loves robots, spends most afternoons after school sweeping the garage floor or handing his father tools, and has quietly appointed himself Ethan's unofficial assistant, a role Ethan never asked for but has come to depend on more than he'd admit. Some Saturdays the two of them didn't talk much at all, just worked side by side under a car for hours, content in the kind of silence that only exists between people who trust each other completely. One rainy morning, Claire Morgan pulled into the garage. Her car had started making an unfamiliar noise, and she wanted it checked before an upcoming work trip. She's 30 years old, an architect by profession, sharp and precise in a way that showed in everything from the way she spoke to the way she carried herself. 2 years earlier, a car accident had left her using a wheelchair. She adapted quickly, or at least she made it look that way to anyone watching from the outside. She drives a modified vehicle fitted with hand controls and an automatic lift system, and she handles every part of the process herself, from lowering the wheelchair to transferring seats, without ever needing to ask for help. She'd rebuilt an entire career around that independence, in fact. As an architect, she'd become known for designing spaces that worked for bodies like hers, though she rarely mentioned that part of her story to new clients unless it came up naturally. Ethan noticed all of it immediately. He noticed how she waved off his instinct to step forward and assist, not rudely, just firmly, the way someone does when they've spent 2 years proving to themselves and everyone else that they don't need it. He noticed the calm efficiency in every movement, practiced enough that it barely looked practiced at all. He didn't offer to help twice. He simply stood back and let her work, the same way he'd want someone to treat him if the roles were ever reversed. There's a particular kind of respect that starts with restraint. Ethan had learned long before Claire ever pulled into his garage. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone is refuse to help until they actually ask for it. He'd learned that lesson slowly, over years of watching well-meaning people rush in to help someone who never asked, often making the moment smaller and more awkward than it needed to be. Claire, he could already tell, had spent 2 years fighting against exactly that kind of unwanted assistance, and he had no intention of adding to the pile. Ethan began his inspection the way he always did, methodical, unhurried, checking every system twice before writing anything down. Ben trailed along behind him for the first few minutes, handing him tools before wandering off toward his usual corner of the garage to work on his latest robot model. Within the first 10 minutes, something caught his attention. A section of the frame had clearly been cut at some point and re-welded, the weld itself noticeably lower quality than anything the manufacturer would have used. It wasn't the kind of repair that matched proper collision standards, the kind he'd flagged dozens of times during his years as an investigator. He crouched lower, running his fingers carefully along the seam, comparing it against the factory welds nearby. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable to someone trained to see it. He pulled out his phone and photographed it from 3 different angles, the way he'd been trained to years earlier, back when documentation like this actually went into an official file instead of his own private notes. Ben wandered back over, curious about what had made his father go so quiet. "Everything okay?" "Just being thorough, Bud," Ethan said, forcing his voice back to normal. "Go finish your robot." "Where was this repaired?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, careful not to alarm her before he understood what he was actually looking at. Claire handed him her insurance file without hesitation, the same folder she'd carried to every mechanic since the accident. The report stated plainly that she had lost control of her vehicle 2 years earlier, resulting in a single-car collision. "It's all in there," she said. "Wet road, lost control, hit a guardrail. Nothing exciting, just bad luck on a bad night." Ethan studied the paperwork, then looked back at the frame beneath the car. Something didn't line up. The type of damage described in the report simply didn't match what he was seeing underneath the vehicle. A single car loss of control accident produces a very specific pattern of stress and impact, typically concentrated along one corner or side, consistent with striking a stationary object like a guardrail or tree. What Ethan was looking at told an entirely different story. The stress patterns ran through the frame at an angle that suggested a much larger impact, something with far more mass behind it, striking from a direction that didn't match a simple loss of control on a wet road at all. He'd seen this exact pattern before, years earlier, during his time investigating collisions professionally. It was the kind of damage that came from being struck broadside by something significantly larger than a passenger car. "Can I ask what you remember from that day?" he asked carefully. Claire's expression shifted, the confident architect softening into something more vulnerable. She told him what little she knew. She had woken up in a hospital bed days later, disoriented, surrounded by machines and unfamiliar faces. A nurse had told her gently that it had been an unfortunate accident. Nothing more specific than that. She'd never had a reason to question it. Grief and recovery had taken up every ounce of energy she had left over those first difficult months, and by the time she was strong enough to ask more questions, the moment for asking them had somehow already passed. "There were so many other things to focus on," she said quietly. "Learning to move around again, physical therapy, figuring out how to drive, how to work, how to just get through a day. The details of the crash itself just felt like something that already happened. Something already over." Ethan listened without interrupting, letting her get through the whole explanation before he said anything else, sensing that this wasn't a story she told often or easily. She had simply accepted it, the way people accept things when questioning them feels like it might cost more than they have left to spend. Ethan didn't say anything else that day. He just wrote a few careful notes in his own private file and told her he needed a little more time before finishing the inspection. "Is something wrong with the car?" Claire asked, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Nothing that affects how it drives," Ethan said, which was true, if not the whole truth. "I just want to be thorough before I hand it back to you." She accepted that easily enough, thanked him, and left her number in case he needed to reach her before the trip. Not every truth disappears with time, he thought to himself later that evening, staring at the photos he'd taken beneath her car. Some truths just sit quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to finally look at them the right way. He sat at his kitchen table long after Ben had gone to bed, the photographs spread out in front of him, replaying every detail of his old job in his mind, trying to convince himself he was wrong about what he was seeing. He wasn't. Over the following days, Ethan cross-referenced everything he could get access to. Old accident scene photographs from the public record. The original repair documentation filed after the crash. The vehicle's identification number, checked carefully against manufacturing records. He spent his evenings at the kitchen table after Ben went to sleep, spreading printouts across the surface, cross-checking numbers against numbers the way he used to when the job had actually depended on it. It felt strange, doing this kind of work again after so many years away from it, like putting on an old coat he'd forgotten still fit. More than once, he almost talked himself out of continuing, telling himself it wasn't his place to dig into someone else's past this deeply over a strange weld. But every time he tried to let it go, the image of Claire calmly explaining that she'd simply accepted the story she was told pulled him right back to the table. What he found stopped him cold. A significant portion of the car's frame had been replaced entirely, using a section taken from a completely different vehicle. It wasn't a simple repair. It was a full structural transplant, expertly disguised to look factory original to anyone who wasn't specifically trained to notice the seams. The donor section, based on the identification markers Ethan could still partially trace, had come from a totaled vehicle sold off at a salvage auction around the same time as Claire's accident. Someone had gone shopping specifically for a matching frame section, which meant someone had known exactly what they needed to hide before they ever started looking. That detail bothered Ethan more than almost anything else he'd found. This wasn't a rushed, careless mistake. It was planned, deliberate, executed with enough care that it had fooled 2 years of inspections, insurance reviews, and Claire herself. There was only one reason a repair like that ever got made this carefully. Someone had gone to significant effort and expense to hide the true cause of that collision. Ethan sat with the evidence spread across his workbench for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He thought about Claire's face when she described waking up in that hospital bed, and about how easily people accept the story they're handed when they're too exhausted to ask for a different one. He called her the next morning and asked her to come by the shop. When he laid it all out for her, photographs, documents, the frame number that didn't match her own vehicle's original build, Claire went completely still, staring at the evidence like she was trying to force it to mean something less serious than it obviously did. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would anyone do this?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted, "but I think you deserve to find out." He noticed her hands tighten slightly around the wheels of her chair, a small, involuntary reaction to news that had clearly landed harder than she wanted to show. "Who would even have access to do something like this?" Claire asked, her voice tightening. "This isn't something you do by accident." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." He was careful not to draw conclusions for her. He simply laid out what the evidence showed, plainly and without exaggeration, and told her the responsible next step was getting the original accident reopened by the proper authorities, people with the legal standing to investigate it properly instead of 2 private citizens piecing it together in a garage. Claire agreed, still shaken, and filed a formal request the following week. The investigation took months. Ethan's documentation became a critical piece of evidence, detailed enough that investigators couldn't easily dismiss it. Old traffic camera footage, previously overlooked, was pulled and re-examined frame by frame. Claire called Ethan every few weeks with updates, sometimes hopeful, sometimes frustrated by how slowly the process moved. He listened patiently each time, never promising an outcome, just reminding her that thorough work usually took longer than anyone wanted it to. The results, when they finally came in, changed everything. The accident had never been Claire's fault at all. A delivery truck had run a red light, striking her vehicle directly, the impact severe enough to total the frame beyond simple repair. Somewhere between the accident and the insurance settlement, records had been altered and the vehicle improperly repaired, shifting the entire narrative and the entire liability quietly onto Claire's shoulders instead of where it actually belonged. Investigators believed the alteration had happened somewhere between the original repair shop and the insurance processing, a chain of decisions made by people trying to close the case quickly and cheaply, with little regard for who ended up paying the cost of that convenience. Nobody had set out specifically to hurt Claire. They had simply chosen the path of least resistance, and she had been the one left holding the consequences. 2 years of guilt, of unanswered questions, of accepting a story that was never true, unraveled in the space of a single investigative report. Someone in the process, whether through negligence or something worse, had let an innocent woman carry the blame for something that was never hers to carry. Claire read through the timeline of events again and again over the following days, trying to make sense of how something this significant had gone unnoticed for so long, by so many people who were supposed to be looking closely. A person who does honest work doesn't only repair machines, Ethan thought, watching Claire read through the final report with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Sometimes, if you're paying close enough attention, you get the chance to help repair justice too. Claire made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't pursuing this for revenge, and she wasn't chasing a lawsuit either, despite more than one lawyer suggesting she absolutely should. "I could probably get a settlement out of this," she told Ethan one afternoon, sitting in his garage while he worked on an unrelated repair nearby. "Everyone keeps telling me I should." "But that's not what you actually want," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." What she wanted was simpler and somehow harder to obtain. She wanted her name cleared. She wanted the record to finally reflect what had actually happened that day, instead of the version that had quietly followed her around for 2 years, shaping the way people looked at her, the way she'd started looking at herself. Ethan stayed by her side through the entire process, showing up to every meeting she asked him to attend, answering questions from investigators when they came up, but he never once tried to make decisions on her behalf. It wasn't his fight to lead, only to support, and he understood the difference clearly enough not to blur the two. A few times, investigators asked him directly what he thought Claire should do next. Each time, he redirected the question back to her. "It's her name being cleared," he said once. "Her call on how to get there." One evening, Ben looked up from his homework at the kitchen table and asked his father a question that had clearly been sitting with him for a while. "If she wins," he asked, "will she be able to walk again?" Ethan set down the wrench he'd been cleaning and considered the question carefully before answering. "Not everything that's lost comes back," he said. "But the truth can." Ben nodded slowly, turning the answer over in his head the way he did with most things his father told him, quiet and thoughtful for a boy his age. "So it's kind of like the trust thing," Ben said eventually. "The part that's broken. You can't always fix it exactly the same as before, but you can still fix something." Ethan looked at his son for a long moment, surprised, the way he often was, by how much Ben actually absorbed from the things he said in passing. "Exactly like that," he said. Over the following weeks, Claire's name was formally cleared in every relevant record. The insurance company issued a correction. The original case file was updated to reflect what the new investigation had proven. It didn't reverse 2 years of living with an injury and a false story stitched together around it. But it did something that mattered just as much in its own way. It meant she no longer had to carry something that was never hers to carry in the first place. Claire framed a single line from the corrected report and hung it in her new office months later, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how close the truth had come to staying buried forever. Justice doesn't always heal a wound completely, Ethan thought, watching Claire's shoulders visibly loosen the day the correction became official. But it does something almost as valuable. It lets a person stop living inside a lie they never agreed to tell. A year later, Claire opened her own design firm. She specialized in accessible architecture, buildings and public spaces designed from the ground up to work for everyone, not retrofitted as an afterthought once someone complained. Her first major contract came from the city itself, a redesign of several public parks to include proper accessible pathways, something she'd pushed for personally after sitting through one too many meetings where accessibility was treated as an optional add-on rather than a basic requirement. Ethan kept running his garage exactly the way he always had, still refusing to cut corners, still teaching Ben the same lessons about broken parts and broken trust every chance he got. One afternoon, Ben showed up at Claire's new office carrying something he'd built himself, a small wooden model of a bridge, carefully constructed over several weekends in his father's garage, sanded smooth and painted a careful shade of blue Ben had picked out himself. He handed it to her a little shyly, suddenly nervous now that the moment had actually arrived. "I made it for your office," he said, "in case you needed something to look at while you're designing stuff." "I think," he said, "bridges don't really help people go faster. They just help more people get across at the same time." Claire looked down at the model in her hands, then up at Ben, and burst into tears she clearly hadn't expected to cry that afternoon. Months later, at the opening of a newly completed accessible pathway in the city park, one Claire had personally designed, she rolled up the gentle incline entirely on her own power, no one pushing, no one hovering nearby just in case. A small crowd had gathered for the ribbon cutting, city officials and local families mixed together, but Claire barely noticed any of them. Her attention was fixed on the two people standing quietly near the bottom of the path. Ethan and Ben stood at the bottom of the path, watching. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer or make a scene. They simply smiled, quietly, the way people smile when they understand something most others in that park probably never would. Claire reached the top of the incline, turned her chair around, and looked back down at the two of them, the late afternoon sun catching the edges of the new pathway behind her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. What Claire had needed most, through all of it, was never pity. It was the chance to live fully within her own ability, on her own terms, without anyone deciding for her what that ability was supposed to look like. Have you ever unintentionally judged someone based on what they couldn't do, instead of noticing everything they were already doing every single day? Which kind of help do you think matters more? Doing something for someone, or simply making space for them to do it themselves? If this story changed the way you look at people even a little, share it and leave a comment below. The strongest thing about a person was never their legs. It was always their refusal to give up.